case stops being investigated and starts being interpreted. Not solved, not clarified, interpreted. In the JonBenét Ramsey case, that moment did not arrive years later. It arrived within days, before lab results were completed, before suspects were stabilized, before investigators even agreed on what the evidence meant. Once that happened, the investigation never truly recovered. Tonight, we begin part 5 of the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, not by asking who did this, but by examining how an investigation lost control of itself in real time. This is the Midnight Mystery Archive in part 5 of the JonBenét Ramsey case. Before we go any further, we need to hit the reset button. Up to this point in the series, we've established several critical facts. The crime scene was compromised very early, almost immediately. The ransom note introduced severe psychological contradictions. Law enforcement agencies disagreed almost immediately on what happened, and no single theory has ever accounted for all of the evidence. Part 5 is where those fractures collide, because what happened after December 26, 1996 may have mattered as much as what happened during that night itself. One of the most interesting things about the JonBenét Ramsey case is how fast it went public. According to journalist Lawrence Schiller, author of Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, the JonBenét Ramsey investigation began leaking information within days of the murder. Not weeks, not months, days. The ransom note, the family's movements, speculation about behavior, even internal disagreements. Schiller documents that leaks originated from multiple places: the Boulder police personnel, the district attorney's office, legal teams attached to the case, and of course, unnamed quote-unquote sources close to the investigation. This matters because homicide investigations rely on information discipline, not secrecy. Discipline. Facts are released deliberately to protect witness memory, preserve investigative leverage, and prevent narrative contamination. That discipline collapsed almost immediately. Instead of a structured release of confirmed facts, the public received a rolling narrative, constantly updated, often contradictory, and rarely contextualized. One of the questions we have to ask ourselves when we look at the JonBenét Ramsey case is what media does to memory. Former Boulder detective Steve Thomas later described a shift investigators noticed almost immediately. Witnesses stopped telling police what they remembered and began telling police what they had heard. This phenomenon is well documented in forensic psychology. Once a narrative circulates widely, memory becomes reconstructive. Confidence increases without accuracy, and uncertainty collapses into belief. By early January 1997, the JonBenét Ramsey case was no longer being processed privately by investigators. It was being processed socially, on television, on newspapers, and increasingly in public conversation. Once that happens, witness reliability degrades rapidly. Investigators are no longer collecting raw evidence. They're filtering belief. Then there's the Boulder police and the district attorney schism that became extremely deep. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the case, and one of the most damaging. According to Schiller's reporting and Steve Thomas's own sworn testimony, the Boulder Police Department and the Boulder District Attorney's Office diverged very early, not on the facts of the case, but on their philosophy. Police investigators believed circumstantial evidence justified aggressive pursuit of the family. Behavioral indicators mattered. The ransom note suggested staging. The DA's office believed the evidence was insufficient. The case was not able to survive a trial, and premature focus on the family was dangerous. As a result, warrant requests stalled. Subpoenas were delayed. Investigative strategies diverged. This did not create balance. It created paralysis. Instead of a unified investigative theory, the case splintered into parallel tracks, sometimes working against each other, and cases cannot survive this. Now let's stop here. This is not about incompetence. It's not about malice. It's about structure. When investigators do not trust prosecutors, and prosecutors do not trust investigators, evidence becomes political. And once evidence becomes political, it stops being purely evidentiary. Then there's the grand jury, and what people think they know versus what actually happened. In 1999, a grand jury was convened. For years, the public believed it returned no indictment. That belief was incomplete. In 2013, previously sealed documents revealed the grand jury voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges related to child abuse resulting in her death. But District Attorney Alex Hunter declined to prosecute. Legal scholars later clarified, grand juries operate under a low evidentiary threshold, and this is true. Indictment does not equal proof. We also know that to be true. Have you ever heard the statement, you could indict a ham sandwich? Prosecutors must consider trial viability. But the secrecy surrounding the decision created a vacuum, and vacuums get filled with certainty. Secrecy often feeds myth as well. According to legal analysts and Schiller's reporting, the decision not to prosecute may have been defensible, but the lack of transparency fueled distrust. To some, it looked like protection. To others, it looked like cowardice. And to many, it looked like confirmation of guilt. Once again, narrative filled the gap left by process. What we've seen so far is not an investigation that failed all at once. It failed incrementally, through leaks, through disagreement, through pressure, and through story. By the end of January 1997, the JonBenét Ramsey case was no longer unfolding privately inside police files. It was unfolding publicly, on television, in newspapers, and in living rooms across the country. What changed next wasn't evidence, it was interpretation. According to Lawrence Schiller, the JonBenét case became one of the first American homicide investigations to be fully absorbed into the 24-hour news cycle. And this mattered, because 24-hour news does not wait for certainty. It feeds on motion and emotion. New experts appeared nightly: handwriting analysts, behavioral psychologists, former law enforcement officers. Many had no access to the full case file. Some had never even worked the investigation. Most were reacting to partial information. Yet their opinions carried weight, not because they were proven, but because they were confident. One of the most damaging dynamics in the JonBenét case was the elevation of expert certainty without evidentiary access. Former FBI profiler opinions were quoted alongside tabloid speculation. Handwriting analysis was discussed without mentioning its subjectivity. Behavioral interpretations were offered without acknowledging trauma variants. According to Steve Thomas, investigators found themselves responding to public narratives instead of developing private ones. This inversion matters. In healthy investigations, evidence shapes theory, and theory guides testing. In JonBenét's case, theory preceded evidence, and evidence was filtered through belief. This is the moment when the case truly destabilized. As forensic clarity failed to emerge quickly, behavior filled the gap. The Ramsey family's actions were scrutinized heavily, hiring attorneys, limiting interviews, and controlling media access. To defense attorneys, this was standard procedure. To investigators, it raised significant suspicion. To the public, it became proof. Psychologists have long warned about this phenomenon. When physical evidence is ambiguous, humans seek meaning in social cues. Silence becomes guilt, emotion becomes deception, and inconsistency becomes intent. But behavior is not evidence. And yet in this case, it became central. Television segments began dissecting interviews frame by frame to read the people in the interviews. Eye movement, posture, tone. Entire theories were built on Patsy Ramsey's affect, John Ramsey's demeanor, Burke Ramsey's later interviews. According to forensic psychologists cited by Lawrence Schiller, this approach is deeply flawed. Trauma is known to disrupt. It can disrupt memory recall, emotional expression, social regulation. There is no normal way to grieve. We've all heard it before. Yet television required normalcy. So any deviation from that was perceived as suspicion. Now let's stop here. This is another area where many cases quietly fail. When the public believes it can see guilt, evidence stops mattering. The JonBenét case didn't just lose control of narrative, it lost neutrality. By mid-1997, The case had entered a feedback loop. Media narrative, public belief, investigative pressure, media reinforcement. Schiller describes this as a closed system. Once a narrative entered circulation, it shaped tip quality, it influenced witness memory, it altered investigative priorities. Investigators began receiving thousands of tips, many referencing theories they had seen on television. This creates noise, and noise buries signals. Law enforcement agencies are not immune to pressure, and it was building. When scrutiny increases, decisions become defensive, documentation increases, innovation decreases. Steve Thomas himself later described feeling boxed in. If he pushed too hard, he was accused of tunnel vision. If he decided to pull back, he was accused of favoritism. This is investigative paralysis in a nutshell, and it compounds existing mistakes. Once the Ramsey family became central to the narrative about what happened to JonBenét, there was no path back to neutrality. Every interview was looked at and scrutinized in every way imaginable. Every silence was interpreted to have some degree of meaning. Every clarification was reframed. According to Schiller, even exculpatory developments were often ignored because they conflicted with established belief. This is the most dangerous phase of any investigation, when evidence must defend itself against a narrative that has spun up around it. When DNA evidence later identified an unknown male profile, it entered a narrative that was already hardened. To some, it meant exoneration. To others, it meant contamination. Former DA Mary Lacy publicly cleared the family, a move that reignited controversy rather than resolving it. Why? Because evidence cannot reset belief once belief has become identity. By the early 2000s, the JonBenét case had ceased to function as a standard homicide investigation. It had become symbolic. To some, it symbolized parental guilt. To others, media excess. To others still, investigative failure. And to many outside looking in, a blend of all three. Symbols are resistant to correction. They don't evolve. They persist. This is the core tragedy of part 5 of this investigation. Not that mistakes were made, they're always going to be made. But that once made, they could not be undone. The case stopped asking questions, and it started defending answers. By the time the JonBenét Ramsey case reached the early 2000s, something irreversible had happened. The investigation hadn't just stalled, it had transformed. What once existed as a homicide case with suspects, evidence, unanswered questions, had become something else entirely. It had become a story people believed they already knew. Criminal cases live in one of two states. They are either actively investigated or passively remembered. Once a case enters the second category, evidence no longer drives inquiry. Memory does. According to Lawrence Schiller, by the early 2000s, the JonBenét Ramsey case had largely shifted into that second category. Law enforcement activity slowed, Media coverage shifted from reporting to retrospectives. Public interest moved from what happened to what do you believe? That shift is subtle, but fatal for resolution. Psychologists who study memory reconstruction note that memory is not playback. It's reconstruction. Each time a case is revisited publicly, details are simplified, contradictions are flattened, uncertainty is replaced with certainty. Over time, people don't remember what happened. They remember what they were told happened. In the JonBenét case, this meant complex forensic debates collapsed into slogans. Investigative nuance disappeared, and early assumptions hardened into facts. As the years passed, the JonBenét case became fertile ground for documentaries. Some were careful. Many were not. They relied on reenactments, selective interviews, simplified timelines. They favored narrative clarity over investigative ambiguity. This is not unique to the JonBenét Ramsey case, but it seemed to matter more here, because ambiguity was the case's defining feature. Each documentary didn't just revisit the case, it re-encoded it. At some point, belief in the JonBenét case stopped being analytical, and it became ideological. People didn't just think the family was involved. They identified with that belief. Others didn't just support the intruder theory, they defended it. Once belief becomes identity, evidence becomes irrelevant. Contradictory information is not evaluated, it's rejected. This is why debates about the case feel so emotionally charged to this day, even almost 30 years later. Now, cold cases can be revived, but only under specific conditions. New evidence, new technology, or new witnesses. What they cannot survive easily is entrenched mythology. Investigators know this. Reopening a case like JonBenét's means confronting public certainty, a group of people who have already made up their mind, managing media expectations, and navigating decades of belief that have become so entrenched in people that it's going to be very hard to change their mind. According to law enforcement consultants, this creates hesitation, even when new tools exist. No investigator wants to reopen a case only to fight public opinion instead of doing their job, which is solving the crime. Modern DNA technology offers promise, but it cannot offer certainty. In JonBenét's case, and we've discussed this before, samples were limited. The potential for contamination is debated, and the interpretation of that DNA evidence as it exists varies, just like every other aspect of this case. Even if new DNA testing produced clearer results, belief systems might still resist them. Can you imagine a scenario where that DNA evidence is tied to an outside intruder and absolves the Ramseys of any involvement? There are a lot of people who simply would refuse to accept that. Because evidence can prove facts, but it cannot easily undo stories and the beliefs that people have built up. Now, let's just take a pause here. This is the quiet tragedy of the JonBenét Ramsey case. Not that it remains unsolved, which is a tragedy in and of itself, but that it may be unsolvable in the mind of the public, even if answers exist and are confirmed. The JonBenét Ramsey case is no longer just a homicide investigation. It is a lesson, and it teaches us a few things. How early mistakes can compound, how media accelerates belief, how narrative can overpower evidence, and how certainty becomes an obstacle to the truth. These lessons matter. They matter a lot, not just for this case, but for every unsolved investigation that follows. The JonBenét Ramsey case didn't fail because investigators stopped caring. It failed because too many people decided they already understood it. When certainty arrives before clarity, truth struggles to survive. And when story replaces method, investigation becomes a performance. As I've mentioned on previous episodes, we've now got MidnightMysteryArchive.com live. You can stream episodes directly from that platform. In addition to that, there is a tab there where you can submit a case that you believe deserves careful, evidence-driven investigation. Go there, click Submit a Case on the MidnightMysteryArchive.com, send me the details, and I'll take a look at it and see if it could be a future episode. You can also join the official Midnight Mystery Archive Facebook. This is new. I just set it up. Come on over, people. We need people joining. And the idea is, hey, we'll be able to link episodes there as well with descriptions, but also discuss cases that we cover on the podcast, but also cases that are in the news. Hey, just by the way, it's December 17th, and there was a new article on the JonBenét case. So let's talk about it. And if this series has earned your trust, ratings matter more than people can possibly realize. Leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or rating the show on Spotify helps this work reach new listeners who care about responsible true crime storytelling and trying to find answers for these cases and their families. Next week will be part 6 of the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, and it's going to be a little different. In that episode, it's not going to be a standard episode, a scripted episode. Oh no, I'm going to be talking a little bit off the cuff. It's going to be a Q&A, and it'll be specifically focused on the JonBenét Ramsey case. I've gotten questions, there's more coming in, and I will be speaking to those questions and giving my answers and thoughts on this very, very polarizing case. I look forward to it. I hope you are as well. Have a very, very Merry Christmas, and we'll see you next time.